Hi there. I'm so glad that you could join me today. It's really good to see you. I would like to continue reading the story I started for you yesterday. We were reading The Incredible Journey by Sheila Burnford, and I said that it was one of those movies that Disney made, but as I was reading the book yesterday, it seemed like there was some things that Disney definitely changed from the original book. But it's no worry there. I would love to continue reading this book for you, so please get relaxed, get yourself a glass of water, a nice hot cup of coffee or tea, something to snack on, and just let your imaginations be entertained. We'll continue on. There was a slight mist when John Longridge rose early the following morning, having fought a losing battle for the middle of the bed with his uninvited bedfellow. He shaved and dressed quickly, watching the mist roll over the fields and the early morning sun break through. It would be a perfect fall day, an Indian summer day, warm and mellow. Downstairs, he found the animals waiting patiently by the door for their early morning run. He let them out, then cooked and ate his solitary breakfast. He was out in the driveway, loading up his car, when the dogs and cat returned from the fields. He fetched some biscuits for them, and they lay by the wall of the house in the early sun, just watching him. He threw the last item into the back of the car, thankful that he had already packed the guns and hunting equipment before the Labrador had seen them, then walked over and patted his head, one by one, each of the pets. "Be good," he said. "Mrs. Oakes will be here soon." "Goodbye, Louth," he said to the Labrador. "I wish I could have taken you with me, but there wouldn't be room in the canoe for 3 of us." He put his hand under the young dog's soft muzzle. The golden brown eyes looked steadily into his, and then the dog did an unexpected thing. He lifted his right paw and placed it in the man's hand. Longridge had seen him do this many a time to his own master, and he was curiously touched and affected by the trust it conveyed, almost wishing he did not have to leave immediately, just after the dog had shown his first responsive gesture. He looked at his watch and realized he was already late. He had no worries about leaving the animals alone outside, as they had never attempted to stray beyond the large garden in the adjacent fields, and they could return inside the house if they wished, for the kitchen door was the kind that closed slowly on a spring. All that he had to do was shoot the inside bolt while the door was open, and after that it did not close properly and could be pushed open from the outside. They looked contented enough too. The cat was washing methodically behind his ears. The old dog sat on his haunches, panting after his run, his long pink tongue lolling out of his grinning mouth, and the Labrador lay quietly by his side. Longridge started the car and waved to them out of the window as he drove slowly down the drive, feeling rather foolish as he did so. "What do I expect them to do in return?" he asked himself with a smile. "Wave back? Or shout, 'Goodbye'?" "The trouble is I've lived too long alone with them, and I'm becoming far too attached to them." The car turned around the bend at the end of the long tree-lined drive, and the animals heard the sound of the engine receding in the distance. The cat transferred his attention to a hind leg. The old dog stopped panting and lay down. The young dog remained stretched out, only his eyes moving and an occasional twitch of his nose. 20 minutes passed by and no move was made. Then suddenly, the young dog rose, stretched himself, and stood looking intently down the drive. He remained like this for several minutes, while the cat watched closely, one leg still pointing upwards. Then slowly the Labrador walked down the driveway and stood at the curve, looking back as though inviting the others to come. The old dog rose too, now, somewhat stiffly, and followed. Together, they turned the corner, out of sight. The cat remained utterly still for a full minute, blue eyes blazing in the dark mask. Then, With a curious hesitating run, he set off in pursuit. The dogs were waiting by the gate when he turned the corner, the old dog peering wistfully back as though he hoped to see his friend Mrs. Oaks materialize with a juicy bone. But when the Labrador started up the road, he followed. The cat still paused by the gate, one paw lifted delicately in the air, undecided, questioning, hesitant. Until suddenly, some inner decision reached. He followed the dogs. Presently, all three disappeared from sight down the dusty road, trotting briskly and with purpose. About an hour later, Mrs. Oaks walked up the driveway from her cottage, carrying a string bag with her working shoes and apron, and a little parcel of tidbits for the animals. Her placid, gentle face wore a rather disappointed look because the dogs usually spied her long before she got to the house and would rush to greet her. I expect Mr. Longridge left them shut inside the house if he was leaving early," she consoled herself. But when she pushed open the kitchen door and walked inside, everything seemed very silent and still. She stood at the foot of the stairs and called them, but there was no answering patter of running feet, only the steady tick-tock of the old clock in the hallway. She walked through the silent house and out into the front garden and stood there calling with a puzzled frown. "Oh well," she spoke her thoughts aloud to the empty, sunny garden. "Perhaps they've gone up to the school. It's a funny thing, though," she continued, sitting on a kitchen chair a few minutes later and tying her shoelaces. "That puss isn't here. He's usually sitting on the windowsill at this time of day. Oh well, he's probably out hunting. I've never known a cat like that for hunting. Doesn't seem natural somehow." She washed and put away the few dishes, then took her cleaning materials into the sitting room. There her eye was caught by a sparkle on the floor by the desk, and she found the glass paperweight, and after that the remaining sheet of the note on the desk. She read it through to where it said, "I will be taking the dogs," and Teo, of course, then looked for the remainder. "That's odd," she thought. "Now where would he have taken them? The cat must have knocked the paperweight off last night. The rest of the note must be somewhere in the room." She searched the room, but it was not until she was emptying the ashtray into the fireplace that she noticed the charred curl of paper in the hearth. She bent down and picked it up carefully, for it was obviously very brittle, but even then most of it crumbled away, and she was left with a fragment which bore the initials JRL. "Now isn't that the queerest thing?" she said to the fireplace, rubbing vigorously at the black marks on the tile. "He must mean he's taking them all to Heron Lake with him. But why would he suddenly do that after all the arrangements we made? He never said a word about it on the telephone. But wait a minute, I remember now. He was just going to say something about them when the line went dead. Perhaps he was just going to tell me." While Mrs. Oaks was amazed that Longridge would take the animals on his vacation, it did not occur to her to be astonished that a cat should go along too. For she was aware that the cat loved the car and always went with the dogs when Longridge drove anywhere or took them farther afield for walks. Like many Siamese cats, he was as obedient and as trained to go on walks as most dogs, and would always return to a whistle. Mrs. Oaks swept and dusted and talked to the house, locked it, and returned home to her cottage. She would have been horrified to the depths of her kindly, well-ordered soul if she had known the truth. Far from sitting sedately in the back of a car traveling north with John Longridge, as she so fondly visualized, the animals were by now many miles away on a deserted country road that ran westward. They had kept a fairly steady pace for the most hour or so, falling into an order which was not to vary for many miles or days. The Labrador ran always by the left shoulder of the old dog, for the bull terrier was very nearly blind in his left eye, and they jogged along fairly steadily together, the bull terrier with his odd, rolling, sailor-like gait, and the Labrador in a slow lope. Some 10 yards behind came the cat, whose attention was frequently distracted when he would stop for a few minutes and then catch up again. But in between these halts, he ran swiftly and steadily, his long, slim body and tail low to the ground. When it was obvious that the old dog was flagging, the Labrador turned off the quiet graveled road and into the shade of a pine wood beside a clear, fast-running creek. The old dog drank deeply, standing up to his chest in the cold water. The cat picked his way very delicately to the edge of an overhanging rock. Afterwards, they rested in the deep pine needles under the trees, the terrier panting heavily with his eyes half closed, and the cat busy with his eternal washing. They lay there for nearly an hour, until the sun struck through the branches above them. The young dog rose and stretched, then walked towards the road. The old dog rose too, stiff-legged, his head low. He walked toward the waiting Labrador, limping slightly and wagging his tail at the cat, who suddenly danced into a patch of sunlight, struck at a drifting leaf, then ran straight at the dogs, swerving at the last moment, and as suddenly sitting down again. They trotted steadily on, all that afternoon, mostly traveling on the grassy verge at the side of the quiet country road, sometimes in the low overgrown ditch that ran alongside, if the acute hearing of the young dog warned them of an approaching car. By the time the afternoon sun lay in long, barred shadows across the road, the cat was still traveling in the smooth, swift bursts, and the young dog was comparatively fresh. But the old dog was very weary, and his pace had dropped to a limping walk. They turned off the road into the bush at the side and walked slowly through a clearing in the trees, pushing their way through the tangled undergrowth at the far end. They came out upon a small open place where a giant spruce had crashed to the ground and left a hollow where the roots had been, filled now with drifted dry leaves and spruce needles. The late afternoon sun slanted through the branches overhead, and it looked invitingly snug and secure. The old dog stood for a minute, his heavy head hanging, and his tired body swaying slightly, then lay down on his side in the hollow. The cat, after a good deal of wary observation, made a little hollow among the spruce needles and curled around it, purring softly. The young dog disappeared into the undergrowth and reappeared presently, his smooth coat dripping water to lie down a little ways apart from the others. The old dog continued to pant exhaustedly for a long time, one hind leg shaking badly, until his eyes closed at last. The labored breaths came further and further apart, and he was sleeping. Still, save for the occasional long shudder. Later on, when darkness fell, the young dog moved over and stretched out closely at his side, and the cat stalked over to lie between his paws, and so, warmed and comforted by their closeness, the old dog slept, momentarily unconscious of his aching, tired body or his hunger. In the nearby hills, a timber wolf howled mournfully. Owls called and answered and glided silently by the great outspread wings, and there were faint whispers of movement and small rustling noises around all through the night. Once an eerie wail like a baby's crying woke the old dog and brought him shivering and whining to his feet. But it was only a porcupine, who scrambled noisily and clumsily down a nearby tree trunk and waddled away, still crying softly. When he lay down again, the cat was gone from his side, another small night hunter slipping through the unquiet shadows that froze to stillness at his passing. The young dog slept in fitful, uneasy starts, his muscles twitching, constantly lifting his head and growling softly. Once he sprang to his feet with a full-throated roar, which brought a sudden splash in the distance. then silence. And who knows what else unknown, unseen or unheard, passed through his mind to disturb him further. Only one thing was clear and certain, that at all costs he was going home. Home to his own beloved master. Home lay to the west, his instinct told him. But he could not leave the other two, so somehow he must take them with him all the way. Well, that was the end of chapter 2. I would like to typically end each of these videos chapter by chapter, so it makes it easier for people who would like to listen to the story again to hear this. But that was a short chapter. I'd like to continue reading if you don't mind. Chapter 3. In the cold hour, before dawn, the bull terrier woke, then staggered painfully to his feet. He was trembling with cold and was extremely hungry and thirsty. He walked stiffly in the direction of the pool nearby, passing on his way the cat, who was crouched over something held between his paws. The terrier heard a crunching sound as the cat's jaws moved, and, wagging his tail in interest, moved over to investigate. The cat regarded him distantly, then stalked away, leaving the carcass, but to the terrier it was a disappointing mess of feathers only. He drank long and deeply at the pool, and on his return tried the feathers again, for he was ravenous. But they stuck in his gullet and he retched them out. He nibbled at some stalks of grass, then, very delicately, his lips rolled back over his teeth, picked up a few overripe raspberries from a low bush. He had always liked to eat domestic raspberries this way, and although the taste was reassuringly familiar, it did nothing to appease his hunger. He was pleased to see the young dog appear presently. He wagged his tail and licked the other's face, then followed resignedly when a move was made towards the direction of the road. They were followed a few moments later by the cat, who was still licking his lips after his feathery breakfast. In the gray light of dawn, the trio continued down the side of the road until they reached a point where it took a right-angled turn. Here they hesitated before a disused logging trail that led westward from the side of the road, its entrance almost concealed by overhanging branches. The leader lifted his head and appeared almost as though he were searching for the scent of something, some reassurance, and apparently he found it, for he led his companions up the trail between the overhanging trees. The going here was softer, the middle was overgrown with grass, and the ruts on either side were full of dead leaves. The close-growing trees, which almost met overhead, would afford more shade when the sun rose higher. These were all considerations that the old dog needed, for he had been tired today, even before he started, and his pace was already considerably slower. Both dogs were very hungry and watched enviously when the cat caught and killed a chipmunk, while they were resting by a stream in the middle of the day. But when the old dog advanced with a hopeful wag of his tail, the cat, growling, retreated into the bushes with his prey. Puzzled and disappointed, the terrier sat listening to the crunching sounds inside the bushes, saliva running from his mouth. A few minutes later, the cat emerged and sat down, daintily cleaning his whiskers. The old dog licked the black Siamese face with his panting tongue and was affectionately patted on the nose in return. Restless with hunger, he wandered up the banks of the creek, investigating every rock and hollow, pushing his hopeful nose through tunnels of withered sedge and into the yielding earth of molehills. Sadly, he lay down by an unrewarding blueberry bush, drew his paws down tightly over his blackened face, then licked the dirt off them. The young dog, too, was hungry, but he would have to be on the verge of starvation before the barriers of deep-rooted Labrador heredity would be broken down. For generations, his ancestors had been bred to retrieve without harming, and there was nothing of the hunter in his makeup. As yet, any killing was abhorrent to him. He drank deeply at the stream and urged his companions on. The trail ran high over the crest of this hilly, wooded country, and the surrounding countryside below was filled with an overwhelming beauty of color. The reds and vermilions of the occasional maples, pale birch, and yellow poplar, and here and there the scarlet clusters of mountain ashberries against a rich dark green background of spruce and pine and cedar. Several times they passed log ramps built into the side of the hill, picking their way across the deep ruts left by the timber sleighs below. And sometimes they passed derelict buildings in rank, overgrown clearings, old stables for the bush horses, and living quarters for the men who had worked there a generation ago. The windows were broken and sagging, and weeds were growing up between the floorboards, and even one old rusted cook stove had fireweed springing from the firebox. The animals, strangely enough, did not like these evidences of human occupation, and skirted them as far as possible, hair raised along their backs. Late in the afternoon, the old dog's pace had slowed down to a stumbling walk, and it seemed as if only sheer determination were keeping him on his feet at all. He was dizzy and swaying, and his heart was pounding. The cat must have sensed this general failing, for he now walked steadily behind the dogs, very close to his tottering old friend, and uttered plaintive, worried bleats. Finally, the old dog came to a standstill by a deep rut half filled with muddy water. He stood there as if he had not even the strength to step around it. His head sagged, and his whole body was trembling. Then, as he tried to lap the water, his legs seemed to crumple under him, and he collapsed, half in and half out of the rut. His eyes were closed, and his body moved only to the long, shallow, shuddering breaths that came at widening intervals. Soon he lay completely limp and still. The young dog became frantic now. He whined as he stretched at the edge of the rut, then nudged and pushed with his nose, doing everything in his power to rouse the huddled, unresponsive body. Again and again he barked, and the cat growled softly and continuously, walking back and forth and rubbing his whole length against the dirty, muddied head. There was no response to their attention. The old dog lay unconscious and remote. The two animals grew silent and sat by his side, disturbed and uneasy, until at last they turned and left him, neither looking back, the Labrador disappearing into the bushes, where the crack of broken branches marked his progress farther and farther away, the cat stalking a partridge, which had appeared at the side of the trail some 100 yards away, and was pecking unconcernedly at the sandy dirt. But at the shrill warning of a squirrel, it flew off across the trail with a sudden whir into the trees, while the cat was still some distance away. Undaunted, still licking his lips in anticipation, the cat continued around a bend in the trail in search of another, and was lost to sight. The shadows lengthened across the deserted track, and the evening wind sighed down. The shadows lengthened across the deserted track, and the evening wind sighed down it to sweep a flurry of whispering leaves across the rut, their brown brittleness light as a benison as they drifted across the unheeding white form. The curious squirrel peered in bright-eyed wonder from a nearby tree, clucking softly to itself. A shrew ran halfway across, paused and ran back, and there was a soft sound of wings as a whiskey-jack landed and swayed to and fro on a birch branch, tilting his head to one side as he looked down and called to his mate to come and join them. The wind died away. A sudden hush descended. Suddenly, there was a sound of a heavy body pushing through the underbrush, unaccompanied by a sharp cracking of branches, and the spell was broken. Chattering shrilly in alarm and excitement, The squirrel ran up the trunk of the tree, and the whiskey jacks flew off. Now onto the trail on all fours scampered a half-grown bear cub, round furry ears, pricked and small, deep-set eyes alight with curiosity in the sharp little face as he beheld the old dog. There was a grunting, snuffling sound in the bush behind the cub. His mother was investigating a rotten tree stump. The cub stood for a moment and then hesitantly advanced towards the rut where the terrier lay. He sniffed around, wrinkling his facile nose at the unfamiliar smell, then reached out a long curved black paw and tapped the white head. For a moment the mists of unconsciousness cleared, and the old dog opened his eyes, aware of the danger. The cub sprang back in alarm and watched from a safe distance. Seeing that there was no further movement, he loped back and cuffed again with his paw, this time harder, and watched for a response. Only enough strength was left in the old dog for a valiant baring of teeth. He snarled faintly with pain and